Hi everyone. In this video we'll look at applying image textures to our objects. I'm going to use the same file as the last video, so feel free to load that up. There's also a zip file called imageassets0608, so you have the same JPEGs I'm using, or you can use your own. Alright, we've done some work with procedural textures, which are mathematically generated by Blender. Now we're going to get our feet wet with using external image files to apply texture to our objects. This is something that you'll be doing a lot more generally than simple procedural textures, so this is the good stuff to get into. It's also a video where you see how that checkerboard pattern was applied to our plane in earlier videos. The first thing I want to do is get rid of the blue material on our plane. You can easily remove that material by deleting it over here in the Material tab, right next to the material name. Now this will unlink the material from the data block. It also won't save the material, it's gone. If we didn't want to lose that material, we could simply replace it with a different one. Deleting is fine in this case. I'm also going to move my sphere up a little bit just to make visuals a little bit easier later. Alright. Next, with my plane selected, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to name it Brick Wall. Next, I'll go to my Texture tab, and I'll click on the New button. Now by default, our texture type is Image or Movie, but if you're using an older type of Blender, it might be something different. Just use the drop-down to get Image or Movie selected if that's the case. That's the one that we want. If we had any previous images in our scene, you could select them by opening the ID data pull-down in our image panel and grabbing them from there. But as this is our first one, I'm just going to click the Open button and bring up my file selection. I'll navigate over and grab the texture called Brick and open it into my scene. Now we see the texture appears in our window, and the location of the texture appears in our location path box. I'm going to go ahead and name this texture Brick. And then let's go ahead and render. Now we immediately see that some things have gone awry. Now, if you've taken a guess based on previous lessons, you may have guessed that our coordinates are off. Blender defaults to UV coordinates, and we need generated coordinates because we haven't UV unwrapped our plane. Scrolling down, we'll change our coordinates from UV to generated, and in this case we'll leave our projection flat. And then let's re-render again. Now our brick displays nicely, but it's not displaying in the direction we want. This is an easy fix. We'll go up to the Image Sampling panel, and then we're going to check the Flip XY Axis checkbox. If we render, we see that our texture now displays correctly. Now, the bricks look pretty good, but what if this was some massive wall in a game or something and we wanted the bricks to be really small in relation to that plane? Well, we could tile the texture. To see that in action, let's go up to Image Mapping, and under Repeat, let's change both the X and the Y axes to 2, and then render once more. Now we've tiled our texture twice in each axis. Before we move forward, I do want to discuss the image path file that I mentioned earlier. The current path for this image comes from my desktop where I put it. If I were to move or remove that image, that link would be broken and the image would not display anymore. Now you would be forgiven for thinking that saving the blend file would preserve the image. However, it will only save the path location, not the image itself. To save the image file with the blend file, we need to pack the image into the file. Now to do this, we'll go down to our image screen and choose the ID data drop-down and select our brick texture. Now instead of a render, we can see the actual texture we're working with. We can then go to our Image tab and select Pack. This will package the image into our scene. Once the scene has been saved, the image will be packed into the file independent of the file path, which we can see is now grayed out. Alright, let's select the data dropdown again and go back to our rendered image. Now, we'll select the sphere object, and in the material editor, we'll create a new material. This time, let's name it Globe. Again, once I've done that, I'll go to the Texture tab, and I'll create a new texture called Earth Map. Once again, I will open my browser, and this time I'll select the texture named Earth. Thank you, NASA. Alright, let's scroll down and again change our coordinates to generated, and this time our mapping to sphere. When we render, we get a nice globe. Remember that if you wanted to share this file, you'd need to pack the image. Otherwise, it'll continue to draw from the file location. I'm also going to rotate my globe on the z-axis a little bit, just so I can see a little bit better part of the map. I want it to be prettier. Alright, I'll re-render, and there we go. That's a little better. Alright, next let's select our cylinder. We'll continue to practice what we've done before and create a new material. This time I'll name it Stone Column. And I'll try hard to remember how to spell column. Then off to our Texture tab, and I'll create a new texture, and I'll name it Sandstone. I'll open up my file browser, and I'll select the sandstone texture from my desktop, and click Open. We'll fix our mapping by selecting Generated in our coordinates, and this time Tube in our projection. We'll also change our repeat in our image mapping panel to 2 in both X and Y. I'll render, and we have a nice sandstone column. Next, we'll select the cube and create a new material. I'll name it Checker Block. I'll go to my Texture tab, and I'll create a new texture. I'll name this, surprisingly enough, Checker. Again, I'll click Open and navigate to my texture named Checker and click Open. In my texture panel, I'm going to scroll down and select Generated, and this time Cube. And then we'll render. We get a nice cube. And we've had lots of practice at setting up these textures a few times over, so I hope you're not too bored. But there is something else I'd like to look at now. I'd like to look at texture size and offset. In our mapping panel, we have XYZ coordinates for both offset and size. To demonstrate our offset more clearly, I'm first going to change my texture size. I'll change my X and my Y coordinates to 0.25. As it's an image, Z really has no effect on it. So I'll go ahead and render, and we get the effect of zooming in on our texture with Blender only mapping part of it to the object, or 25% of it. Alright, now that we can see our checkers a little more clearly, let's click on our offset for X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to make them all negative 0.3. Now when we render, we can see that Blender has scrolled, or offset, the portion of the texture that it's mapping to the object. This can be really handy for fine-tuning how a map projects on an object and getting something like a cube if you were making, say, some kind of crate asset or something, getting it to really look spot on. Alright, let's reset both coordinates. Get back to 1 and get all of our offset back to 0. And go ahead and re-render. And now I want to go back and select our sphere object. Over in the material heading, much like we did in previous lessons for our plane, I'm going to give the material a kind of Mars red diffuse color. Mind you, that's in the material heading, not the texture heading. Now in the Texture tab, I'm reduce my color influence way down here at the bottom by about half and render. Alright, that's an interesting result. I'm going to try clicking negative, which will reverse the values that are being used, and render again. It's making a pretty good dead earth for right off the top of our heads. Alright, you can spend some time playing with the various blend modes and see what kind of results you get, and see how they react when you also bring the negative checkbox into play. After that, I'll see you in the next video.